Hello, everyone. Welcome back to I See What You're Saying, the Disciplined Listening Podcast. I'm Michael Reddington, and today it is my pleasure to welcome our next guest, Scott Ramey. Scott is the founder of the Ramey Group. He is a former Fortune 500 C-suite executive who's been responsible for driving over 100 with a billion in sales throughout his career. He currently teaches sales leaders how to drive success with his 4 pillars of authentic sales. And this was a tremendous conversation that I'm really excited to share with everyone. Scott is a quote machine. So get your pen, get your paper ready as you listen to this. He has a ton of great insights and ideas to share with everybody. We're going to dive all the way into his 4 pillars of authentic sales. I love how he talks about approaching influence as a campaign. It's not as simple as one thing you say or do. It's a process. He breaks it down wonderfully. He's also going to talk about how we can scale trust inside and outside of our organization and so much more. This really is a great action-packed conversation. I'm thankful Scott chose to spend an hour with us. I'm really excited that you're all here today. Thank you for being here for another episode. We truly appreciate it. There's going to be a lot to take away from this conversation, I promise. Before we get started, if you could just take a second to like the show, subscribe to the show, share it. We would certainly appreciate that. And of course, before we start, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors real quick. HumanTell. If you haven't already, please head over to humantell.com. Check out their best-in-class training for how to identify when people's emotions are shifting through their facial expressions and nonverbal communication. Enter the code INQUASIVE25 for 25% off the training of your choice and begin to develop the skill set to understanding what people are likely thinking and feeling at any moment. For the professional interviewers, please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. You will get all your questions answered for both the International Association of Interviewers and the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation. Everything you can get from and give to the association, and all you need to know if you qualify, how to prepare for, and how to leverage the CFI designation in your career. And while you're online, we'd appreciate it if you went to inquasive.com. That's where you can learn more about the customized programs our clients ask us to facilitate for their senior leaders, their sales teams, their HR teams, and more to teach them how to apply the strategic observation and persuasive communication skills necessary to connect with people and encourage them to share their everyday confessions throughout your high-value conversations. We truly appreciate you all being here for another week. Thank you so much. So now, without further ado, I introduce to you, Scott Ramey. Hello, Scott. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Michael. This is very cool. I'm excited about this conversation.
My pleasure, man. I've been excited ever since your team reached out. We finally get to connect and talk with each other. And for me, just learning the little bit that I did about your background before we got on, I'm really excited about how you work, not just with sales teams, but particularly with sales leaders. I feel like a lot of times the sales team out driving the business gets a lot of the attention, but the sales leaders, there's, I guess, often assumptions of their ability or capability, and they kind of fall into the cracks. And I also appreciated, at least reading up on you, how you share a little about your experience and things that you learned and overcame along the way and how that applies to what you do. And to the degree that we can, I look forward to discussing that today. But enough already. Let's get to it. So we were talking a little bit before we hit record, and one of the areas I'd love to explore with you right out of the gate, and please take as much time as you want to get us started here. With the work that you do, how do you focus on not just supporting sales leaders, but equipping them with the tools to really drive alignment from the organization through their team out to the customers?
Thanks, Mike. Again, thank you for having me. I'm so excited about our conversation with your background. So Roy Vaden, who I've gotten to know really well through Brand Builders Group, says you're most uniquely positioned to help the person you once were. And so what I see in others, I definitely saw in myself in the rare occasions, and it was it was few and far between, thank goodness. I was very fortunate in my career. But when an organization is underperforming, what's happening? And then I think of sales leaders and salespeople in general within the organization as both the puppet and the puppet master, kind of the archer and the arrow. And so there's this immense pressure placed on sales organizations to perform for obvious reasons. But what happens when the organization is not aligned in a way that really truly can support that sales leader and his or her team? And so that's really where I lean in. So, I think of organizations that are quote unquote broken. They're not really broken in that moment. They may not be forming at an optimal level. So I've developed a process it can be applied to self and team and organizations, but it's around the first step in the process is around surfacing the tension. And I shared the quote with you earlier is what you're not saying out loud. Your team's already whispering. That's the concept. I mean, I think we're reluctant on many occasions to really surface all the tensions that exist in organization, in our teams, in ourselves. And then the second step in the process is to unify the message. I like to say one voice, many echoes. Like, how do we reverberate the voice of the leader, the voice of the organization, the vision of the organization across the team? And then this is probably very obvious, but aligning the team. It's amazing what happens when you really just surface that tension. You start to release the pressure because when you surface the tension, people are like, "Hey, I'm being heard. I'm being seen." He or she recognizes as a leader, recognizes the tension in the organization. And it's just amazing what happens with team alignment. And the last step is, assuming you've taken those appropriate steps, it's like, how do I influence the organization as a leader where I become at cause, not at effect, that I am operating and pushing the tempo of the organization so that it betters us as a company and organization, but also my team. So I think about that as influence isn't about who reports to you, it's about who starts to repeat you. And so in my career, I've noticed when the organization gets behind a sales organization, there's a very cool rhythm and operating tempo. And people start to repeat the message that you're talking about. And so everything starts to come in alignment. But I really feel for sales leaders who maybe are on the end of really unfortunate circumstances within the organization. And many don't know how to influence the company in a way that's going to make it more impactful. So that's how I think about it. And there's a lot of places we can go, I'm sure, with that whole concept.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Not only is there a lot of ways we can go in that concept, but a lot of times little thing that people maybe will be entertained by briefly or not. Often in a conversation, I'm like, okay, at some point in the next hour, somebody will say something that will be the title of the episode. And you just gave me like 5 options in the first 30 seconds. So I appreciate you putting me to work that early. But with your 4 steps, I feel like we could probably spend an hour on each one of those. Yeah. And I feel like influence and influencing the organization is probably where we should spend the bulk of time based on the conversation we had prior and what you just said. But if you don't mind, I'd like to touch on the other 3 first and kind of build our way there. When you talk about surfacing the tension, I agree entirely with how important that is for all the reasons you stated and beyond. But there can be an art to doing that. And we don't want to cast blame. We don't want to be all doom and gloom. Like, this sucks. We're all going to die. Like, there's a certain way to get the message across. When you work with organizations on techniques for surfacing the tension, what are some of the most effective ways you've seen to get the tension out in the room so people can work through it productively?
Yeah, look, I've said my entire career, Jim Collins' Good to Great was a fantastic book, a model of kind of viewing what a great organization looks like. Not once in his book does he mention that blame is a recipe for success.
No.
So it's a blameless exercise, and that's really difficult for people to do. It really is, Michael. I think, I was in a meeting yesterday, and I knew I wasn't pulling my weight in this respective endeavor that we're upon. And the energy was geared towards me, but it wasn't explicitly stated to me. I would have preferred the conversation to be, Scott, you're not pulling your weight here. What can you do differently? Now, it stings a little bit, and it stung a little bit last night, but I think there's this blameless process that has to occur. The framework I've developed is really simple. It's a pneumatic or an acronym. It's just clear. Collect the symptoms, locate the gaps, explore the root tensions, align the themes, and reveal what true work you need to do through prioritization. And that's really the important part. You can't boil the ocean. I never, ever, ever worked for an organization that had unlimited resources. I worked for many organizations that didn't know how to prioritize. And so, but it's a blameless exercise. It's not one that because you don't want to put people in a defensive position. You say, look, state the obvious. I think my mentor years and years and years ago told me as a leader, one of the most powerful things you can do is just state the obvious. And so that's the process that needs to be done. I'm baffled at how few times it actually gets done because people are afraid of creating more friction and more tension. But I think about the law of vibration. I mean, everything has a frequency and vibration to it. Not to get too esoteric, or as my kids call me, a hippie when I go down paths like this, but I'll graciously accept that as a compliment. But everything has energy. The universe, everything has some sort of frequency involved. Tension, if you think of it rather than energy or vibrations, think of it like an emotional tone scale. And if you walk in, well, I do. I walk into organizations, I work with leaders, and I find them on the spectrum of the emotional tone scale, elation to desperation and everything in between. And so I think the secret is to try to figure out where your organization, your team is in that emotional tone scale, and see how willing they are to receive this information and prepared to receive it. And so it's a really delicate dance. I will admit that. But if you don't surface the tension, there's no way you can turn toward it.
Amen. Again, totally in line with everything that you said. And to touch on just that fear base, I'm afraid if I talk about it, I'm going to make things worse. Well, we can't solve a problem if it's not on the table. So things are certainly going to get worse if I don't put it on the table. How do we do that? I love how you talked about making it blameless. And I'd love your feedback on this. For me, I've found that oftentimes if we take the word you out, and there's times where it's appropriate, but if we take the word you out, it tends to be a lot less blameless. Scott, where are you on this? Scott, how come you haven't done this? Scott, how come your team isn't? Scott, where is your team on? Those words, you and your, maximize people's defenses right away. So I find if we can work from the outcome backwards, that generally that tends to be more effective. So Scott, as we look at this project, our customer is expecting X. It feels like we're currently on pace for Y. Please walk me through the obstacles that stand between where we are now and where we need to be. Now it's a goal and obstacle focused conversation, and it doesn't come across as what the hell is wrong with you, which tends to put people on the defensive.
I completely agree, Michael, 100%. And that really speaks to the idea of if everybody in the organization is clear about what we are trying to accomplish together, which is a baseline, I would argue that's probably even a baseline. If everybody's clear that this is what we're trying to accomplish, then there's no confusion about what's happening to get there. Again, there's that, but that's part of the challenge too, is we're not clear on what that looks like. Just on the tension point, I have my iPhone cord here. This is tension. I wish I would have had a rubber band. I don't. But the concept that I'm really trying to work towards is you have to turn toward the tension. If you move away from it, it gets tighter. More stress. It's like an Achilles ready to snap, which I've done, which is not pleasant.
No.
If you move towards the tension, things get relaxed and freed up. That's the simple concept here. So we're carrying around all of this energy. In many instances, it's not productive energy. We're blaming, we're pointing fingers. It's ops' fault. It's the service team's fault. Our call center's been outsourced. On and on and on. I could go on. Marketing's just developing pretty stuff. They're not developing stuff that sales. All of this burden, but it gets shifted really most of the time to the sales team because they're like, where are your results?
Yeah.
And so if you surface attention before you find yourself in a quarterly review meeting or a monthly review meeting or a meeting with the CEO to talk about the revenue, if you start to surface that tension and then start to do the other steps to align the organization and influence the organization, it's pretty miraculous what happens. But if you don't, it's got to start with the tension because everybody else is talking about the problems. Everybody's, maybe they're not brave enough in that moment in the meeting to raise it, say, Michael, I see this challenge that we're facing. I have a solution too, by the way, and here's what it could look like. I think that's really what I've seen time and time again.
I think you're spot on. And it's two things. You talk about the person that sees the problem and has a solution. I feel like from just my observation, generally the teams, the leaders that are, and even the people that are the most successful are the ones that can pivot from problem identification to solution creation the fastest. Like they don't get wallowed down in the problem itself. Mm-hmm. But then your point about people are already talking about it. Like one of the perhaps ironic lessons that I learned in investigations that have carried forward is by the time anybody surfaced an investigation to me, I was the last one to know. People tried to solve it at different levels of the organization, and other people talked about it, and rumors swirled, and the quote unquote guilty people had plenty of time to figure out their story. So like for me to be upset that I was the last one to know was entirely counterproductive. Like the sooner I could just kind of laugh it off and be like, okay, well, how far behind am I? Let's go figure it out. It's the same thing for tension. You said it earlier. People are already whispering about it. So let's talk about it.
I would much prefer that leaders especially, be the cause of alignment and not the effect of dysfunction. cause and effect. Like I don't want to be an effect. I don't want to be the victim of circumstances that happen in the organization. My thinking was always, how can I be on my front foot? How can I be proactive versus reactive? Because if you're being reactive, you're already in a very difficult spot. Now, look, this is not easy. Depending on the size and scope and breadth of the organization, trust me, I know it's not easy. But even if you just started with your own team, forget about the rest of the company. Like just start with your own team. Like, okay, what is really happening here and what are you seeing? And I've developed what I call the tension map, which is just, it's literally a T diagram. I think it was the old Ben Franklin T diagram. On the left-hand side, symptoms, what are you seeing and feeling? On the right hand, root tension causes, what's causing it, what's underneath it. And it's a simple process you can go through. It's like, okay, what are you feeling and seeing right now? Well, our product's not competitive, or we were late to the market, so we're playing catch up, but it just gets everybody on the level playing field. But most importantly, it makes everybody feel like they've been heard. And now I'm starting to grow the energy within my team, and I'm saying, okay, now we're all aligned. Now we see the challenge, and then we, as I said earlier, we put in a plan in place to start to address the tension that we're experiencing.
So let's capitalize on kind of both ends of what you just talked about, the talking and the helping people feel heard and seen and participating in the process. I feel like we can do unifying the message and aligning the team at the same time. We can kind of combine those and then get into influence. So when you look at, now that the tension hopefully has been surfaced and we are getting people involved in having these conversations, again, kind of best practices, what have you seen most successful for unifying the message and aligning the team?
Yeah, well, look, I think first and foremost, when everyone says something different, no one gets heard.
Yeah.
And so I think from a sales organization standpoint, if we're not all aligned in terms of how our go-to-market narrative and messaging comes together, then I think we're diluting ourselves and our brand in the marketplace. And that's the biggest challenge I've seen. Working with clients who have a really, really great story, but it's multiplied by 20 because everybody on the sales team is saying something very different. You build momentum, you build brand, you build awareness, especially if you're relatively new to the market, or even if you're unknown, maybe more importantly, if you're unknown. But it doesn't matter if you're unknown or you're new. Every organization that I've seen that really struggled to hit their numbers, they're not unified in how they go to market. And so getting really clear on that process and what that looks like and creating the concept of one voice, many echoes. You need to reverberate. It's like a pebble in a pond. If you drop a pebble in a pond, the vibration, the reverberation continues. The same thing with your message. And so it's important. But here's why it's important for what I would call underperformance in an organization or misalignment in an organization. It's because when we're crystal clear as a sales team what we want to say, then the organization gets really clear on what we're going to say. And so then as I said earlier, when you hear others start to repeat the message. So if you have your strategy, most of the time strategy is pretty in line, it's pretty effective. Everybody's pretty much aligned. I say pretty much because that's not always the case. Mostly aligned on what the strategy looks like. But the next level of that is like, how do we create this consistent story so that we're all heard and we're heard consistently? And also to simplify the approach when you're sitting across from somebody. And which I'm sure we'll talk about, like what do we see in terms of the tactical errors of when we're quote unquote pitching or selling, which is something I just absolutely don't like to have. The idea of selling something or pitching something is just, to me, is so 80s. It's just that doesn't work. So I think that's how I view it.
Yeah, I'm in alignment on the pitch. We'll circle back to that for sure. And I really like what you said about unifying the message. You're a quote machine, one voice, many echoes. Like I'm going to burn through a pen and a pad of paper trying to keep up with you as we go through. But I really like what you said about making sure the message is consistent both inside and outside of the organization. Like in a lot of ways, if the sales messaging is consistent, then that works its way back up through the organization, like you mentioned. So everything is consistent. But also from a brand building perspective, yes, it's important. From a customer relationship building, yes, it's important. But even like thinking about it from a sales leader's perspective, from a coaching, from a guiding, right, from a mentoring, from a consistency standpoint, all of these things, it's important. I have a pet peeve. I'd love your thoughts on this. And feel free to contradict me at any point in time. You're never going to hurt my feelings. For me, one of the things that drives me nuts is when I'm working with the sales organization, particularly a leader, and we're talking about the conversations and the messaging going out. And the leader says something along the lines of, well, I don't believe in scripts. I don't want to tell them what to say. They need to go out and do what's best for them. For me, that I'm not saying it's wrong, but for me, that feels like a cop-out. Like what you're really saying is, I'm not sure I want to take the time to unify the messaging, teach everybody, and hold them accountable. I'd rather let them go say it the way they want to and they're comfortable with, because that's what will work for them, maybe. But then it creates the inconsistency, it creates the opportunity. So I'm not saying that everybody should have a script and be robotic. That's not what I'm saying at all. However, when everybody, in my belief, is that when everybody is clear on how the message needs to be communicated, then they have the opportunity to take a little bit of poetic license within that messaging for their personality. So it's not the script for script's sake. Call it framework, call whatever you want. But here's how the message should be delivered and needs to be received. Scott, Mike, if you want to tweak it a little bit within that, feel free. But I feel like for the sales leaders that are like, no, we don't do that. People go out and they prospect and they talk the way they want to. I feel like that's just a cop-out that creates more difficulty in leading the team and building brand and customer awareness.
Look, I couldn't agree more. It's high performers want to be coached. Think of every great athlete that comes to mind in this moment. Every single one of them has a quote unquote team around them to coach them. I think it's a cop out. Look, I don't believe in scripting long form. What I've seen over and over and over again, let's just take, company X, new product launches. What do? We send out an email to our team and said, here's the new the PDF marketing brochure you can use. We've updated our website. And then we send out a long form version of the quote unquote story. We don't train them. We don't develop them. We don't get them in a room and say, hey, on a quarterly basis, this is a new campaign focus we're going to have, and here's the messaging. I prefer bullet point over long form because, to Michael, to your point, it gives people freedom and flexibility to reveal their true self. That's the value of that. I don't want somebody to go in and make a pitch using a script. I want somebody to go in and connect genuinely and authentically interested in somebody else, position the solution with well-constructed, thoughtful points that are going to resonate, that are consistent so I can build the brand and start to have impact across an organization. I came from the financial services industry. If I would have gone to Wells Fargo, for example, a client of ours back in the day, and positioned a script, hardcore positioned a script on a product that we were launching, and the rest of the organization did the same thing, then I think we're not connecting them with them genuinely. If I would have gone to Wells in a very thoughtful manner with bullet point driven concepts around the product and solution, formally launched that with my team, who was also calling on Wells Fargo, and we're all consistent with one voice, many echoes that reverberates, then I'm not getting somebody from California calling into the Wells Fargo sales desk saying, hey, I was just positioning this particular product. This is how it works. And that person who heard the message in the home office is trying to help them hear something different. I mean, it creates, now that's an extreme example, but I'm telling you, I've saw this time and time again. We need to stop launching product via email with a long form scripted narrative. I can't remember that. I never could, which is why I created my process the way I created it. I cannot memorize content. I don't do it for my keynotes. I don't do it for workshops. I don't teach clients to do that. It's very, very difficult. And moreover, if you can't show up as yourself, you're already lost. You've already lost. So I agree 100% with your point. You got me. Trigger alert, Michael. Trigger alert.
Didn't mean to set us both off, but no, I'm with you. And I'll double down on your bullet point for a second. You mentioned like the keynotes and the workshops that you do. For anybody that cares, anytime I'm preparing for a presentation, and it's more important the shorter that it is. I don't know about you, but the more time I have, to circle back and do whatever. But the shorter it is, like keynote or whatever, I'm not memorizing the whole thing. If I've got an hour, I might memorize 8 to 12 bullet points, to your point. And then if I hit those bullet points in general order, then I can, based on the crowd, I can be who I need to be in that moment to get the message across to that audience, as opposed to trying to memorize the entire script. And the same is true if I'm preparing for a business development conversation. If I'm meeting with a new prospect, it's kind of a cold, he's heard of me, I've heard of her, whatever, we're finally having the conversation. I'm not going to script out the whole thing. I'm going to sort of have phases that I'm looking to go through. And maybe I get them in the same order, maybe I don't. But the core components are going to be there in the conversation where they need to be. So I love that. If you focus on the most important parts, you can build yourself around them.
Yeah, and this shameless plug, but it's worth if people want to go to my website, and we'll talk about it later. But I created what I call the power of three, which is just a simple way to craft your value proposition, your sales narrative. It's really taking the complex. The problem is we think we need more time to make a point. You need fewer words. And so the power of three you can download from my website, and it's for free, no obligation, because I think it will help people say, all right, I have all this information, all this knowledge. I need to tell you everything I know. You've lost them. You've lost
Instantly. Instantly. I found it's maybe a silly example, and then I want to get back to your influence, but not even less words. Like sometimes it can just be a sentence.
Yeah.
So very long story short, I was working with what's the word I want to use? Like whatever, an organization that has basically two wings. One is financial, one is construction. And they were bringing me in specifically to work with like contract negotiations. And so they give me this whole long thing on their contracts, and I'm listening and I'm taking notes. So this is all going to be important for me to know if we agree to move forward. And the last thing the woman giving me their spiel says, if I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it was something like, and get the signed contract back as quickly as possible. All I did was look at her and say, with as few red lines as necessary. And she looks at the guy sitting next to her and says, he gets it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I do yet, but I got time. Like, we'll build in the details. But just the ability to resonate like that instead of, well, I've done contract negotiation and blah, 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 blah. Like just that one little sentence does it, which I think is a good setup for influence. You talked a lot about influence both outside and inside of the organization. This is your topic. This is what you teach. This is how you do it. So in any order that you choose, what are the most effective influencing techniques or processes you've seen from a sales leader perspective inside and outside the organization?
Yeah. So I love this. I love this because admittedly I didn't do it well, at least at one stop. And I've learned, we learned, as I said earlier, Rory, you're most uniquely positioned to help the person. So ignited passion in me to try to get it right for everybody else because I didn't do it well myself once. My mentor, Bob, told me like, you need to, this is years and years and years ago, think of influence as a campaign. And so I've simplified it. I created what I call an influence map. And so when you kind of look across the organization, there are going to be, people are going to fall into one of four categories, I think, in terms of what you're seeing, in terms of how they feel about you and your sales organization. And the whole idea is that we want to churn resistance into relationships, which is not easy to do because I'm sure people who are listening right now are like, but so Bob is so impossible to deal with. And, he's never been a fan of mine. I don't have a relationship. Well, that's part of the problem. A thing will persist until it's admired. So you got to admire Bob for how difficult he is to work with. But it's also your job and your responsibility, particularly if Bob is in a position that has power over your ability to execute on what you need. You've got to influence him. So I think about the steps, and I'll get into the map and how that works in a second. But I think about the steps is you need to expand your influence. You need to shape the strategy. You need to model clarity, which is, again, the messaging is so important to that. And you need to scale your trust. So those are the steps. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need to identify in the influence map the champions. Who are the people that believe in my vision, that are actively supporting me already? And how do I leverage them? How do I keep them closer even? And I know this is going to resonate with everybody who's listening to this, who finds himself in an organization that may be slightly a bit dysfunctional. Then you need to identify the skeptics. They're not sold, but they're open. They're kind of lukewarm. And we need to educate, engage, and listen more to what their concerns are. There's something about your strategy or what you're trying to accomplish that they're not quite 100% on board yet. And then the Bobs of the world, the detractors, they're resisting or blocking progressively or covertly. The way I viewed this in my career was like I always felt from certain people that there was this quiet undercurrent of what I call counterintention. And the idea is I wanted to surface that to the top so I could start to handle it and influence them in a more productive way. It wasn't always successful, and I'm not suggesting you're going to be able to get all of the detractors on board, but you need to try. And then lastly what maybe more difficult are the neutrals. They're quiet, they're disengaged, they're undecided. They can drift either way, but you also don't know where they are. And so I think there you have to activate those folks with a purpose. So I think of that as this tension map. And if you evaluated where the tension is in your organization, then you know where you can spend your time. And what I find, particularly as the further up you go in an organization, the less time you have for this type of, frankly, for that matter, Michael, all the things we're talking about today. Managing your team, leading your team, aligning your team, like the work that requires us to do this. You're busy pulling together PowerPoints and responding to quarterly requests and so on and so forth. I get it. But these are important elements and steps you have to take to turn this resistance into relationships. So that's how I would approach it.
Turn resistance into relationships. By the time we're done, I might have a Scott Ramey quote book ready to go. I ask for a small portion of the proceeds. That's all I ask for.
You got it.
Quote machine, keep hammering away. But I love everything that you just said. To kind of work backwards a little bit, the lack of time, from my perspective, is why everything you're talking about is so important. Because it might seem like it takes a little bit more time up front, which is probably true in many scenarios, but it takes less and less time the more you do it. By surfacing the tension, making people comfortable talking about it, by unifying the message, by reading the tension map, understanding, you can even, influence as a campaign, of all the things you've said, is fighting for my favorite. One of my, how many pet peeves have I confessed to so far in this conversation? But one of them is when people want like the influence hack. What's the one thing I need to say? What's the one thing I need to do? Brother, it doesn't exist. Like, it's going to be a period of time. And depending on what you're trying to achieve and who you're trying to achieve it with, depends on how much time and how many touches and how many ups and downs and roller coaster. Like, there's no one thing. So to think about it as a campaign, I love. This isn't one conversation. It's multiple conversations, plus the interactions between the formal conversations, the mortar that keeps the bricks together. So important. So when we have less time, if we do a better job putting this in play, yeah, it might feel like half a step back in the beginning, but it saves so much time, stress, and energy moving forward. You talked a little bit about scaling trust in there. And if I'm skipping ahead and there's something else you want to talk about in between, let me know. Yeah. Trust is one of these things that people talk about all the time. And I feel like I have conversations with some people who have very like tactical, specific, build trust, do this, show that. And I feel like I talk to other people who talk about building trust, and it's a little bit more like esoteric. And there's value in all of it. But when you specifically talk about scaling trust as a leader of a sales team, sales organization, what can we do to scale trust? I'll ask both within our team and on behalf of our organization.
So team, let's start with team, and then the organization will follow. So scaling trust from my point of view is being crystal clear about what your objective looks like. What's the end date? And the exercise I would do with my team to get them at least to understand what we're trying to accomplish. Because trust is, to me, when there's not trust, it's usually because of poor communication and lack of affinity. Do I genuinely like you? Can I connect with you? And you don't have to necessarily be friends. In fact, many people you're going to work with, you're not going to be friends. But do we at least have something in common? Is there like a affinity? Communication. Are we communicating clearly, frequently enough? Are we? Do we have shared experiences? And so the idea around scaling trust is creating these moments of shared experiences. So where I usually would start was, what is our ideal scene? 5 years from now, the Wall Street Journal has a headline, and this is what I call the headline exercise. They're going to write an article about us. What are they going to say? Just as a baseline, like, what are they going to say? And it's amazing what happens for this exercise for a lot of reasons. One is it unlocks creativity, so immediately reduces cortisol. And people start to think about what is possible. And so, okay, now that we know what's possible, where do we go from there? And trust in a team, this is slightly different from an organization, but I would recommend the organization do it the same. Trust can be built relatively quickly. If I truly understand what you, Michael, are about, your background, the challenges, what brought you here, what scares you, I am going to have a more empathetic response to you, because trust to me is an empathetic type of approach. So the exercise I would do in this case I would literally hand everybody a piece of paper on my team, and I would have them write down their story. What brought you here? What scares the hell out of you? What was your childhood like? And they would write out their story for 30 to 45 minutes. And then we'd have them wall it up in a ball, throw it in the middle of a room, but before they threw it in the room, they put a little symbol on it so they knew it was theirs. And then each person would go grab one of those balls of paper from the middle of the room and then read somebody else's story. And then the team would try to figure out whose story that was. You had people who were emotional, who were crying, who were elated. But what it brought us all closer to each other. And what makes you tick? One of the first questions I would ask in every interview I would ever do, well, two questions always asked. What makes you tick? Like, who are you? What do you stand for? And I don't know why we're so reluctant to have these conversations in corporate settings. Because if I know what makes you tick, what's the energy behind you, then I can help create what you need to create, what you want to create, how you get fulfilled. And it's such a disconnect. So it's very much an empathetic exercise I think you have to go through. And I did the same thing when I was in my influence map. I would do the same thing with people. I'd get to know them personally. What makes them tick? What motivates them? What drives them? If they're highly analytical, which I am far from, then I knew I needed to communicate with them on their terms, not on my terms. If they were more like me, who liked to communicate in bullet points rather than long, then that's how I would communicate with them. But I would communicate with them in the area that they felt comfortable, not in how I felt comfortable. And it required me to stretch myself a little bit because I'm not highly technical. I'm very much a strategy person, not a tactical person. So I found more tension existed with that person than with somebody who was more strategic and kind of creative and et cetera. But that's where it starts and that's where it ends. I mean, trust is built by saying, I get you, I understand you, I know what drives you, I know what motivates you, I know where your pain is, and I'm going to help remove some of that from you, and we'll move forward together.
I like that. And the part that I really like most was, in case you care about my opinion, I should probably preface that.
I do care about your opinion.
Is communicating with people the way they need to. I feel like another mini rant here, like take any given assessment. When somebody takes an assessment and it gives them their like personality type or communication type, there's two ways to handle that. One is to look at that and say, okay, well, this could be who I am and other people see me. So I need to make sure I adjust that when I communicate with them. Or the other way is to hold it up like a trophy and say, this is who I am, and you need to tolerate me as this and understand that I will always communicate as this, and here's my justification. And I feel like way too many people go option B instead of option A, and then blame the other person and get frustrated when they don't get it. They don't get the message. They didn't hear what I was saying. They're not doing what I was asked. Well, it's because we communicated in a way that was easy, familiar, comfortable for us, but not for them. And in a lot of ways, I would double down and say that not only building trust, but influencing others really requires us to communicate with them the way they need to be communicated with at any given moment in time. And if we're unwilling or unable to make that shift, then we're going to be playing from behind consistently, and that's going to be more of our fault than their fault.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the alternative, and not to be overly direct with the audience here, but you can either be the cause of alignment or at effective dysfunction, and you can, in 6 months, explain why you're no longer at the organization because you didn't perform. Yeah. I mean, that's really not to be that, but that's really what this comes down to. All of this, like your livelihood, like if you think about it really tactically, your livelihood as a sales leader, especially, and as a salesperson in many respects, but as a sales leader, especially, your livelihood is you're counting on a lot of other people. You're counting on a lot of other people for your success. So you can either say, I'm going to own it and take responsibility to align everyone and be at a cause, or you're going to be at effect and you're going to be explaining what happened to all your friends and family members, because that's really what it comes down to. And I always prefer to be a cause. And even if I wasn't able to influence at a level I wanted to be influenced, and I could say, you know what, I tried. And then maybe the organization ultimately wasn't aligned with what I was trying to accomplish and my core values and what I stand for. I'm okay. I know I did my best. It's time to move on to the next thing. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, but very rarely does that happen. Very rarely does that happen if you really take the action necessary to get everybody on the same page.
And to take the action necessary to get on the same page generally involves the ability to truly listen to others. And I know this is something that you talk about a lot. And share a little bit of my perspective, then I'm going to turn the mic over to you for as long as you want it. I feel like often the people who struggle to listen the most, if we were going to categorize them in business terms, are senior leaders and technical experts. Mm. And many people who run sales teams are both. Often their technical expertise is what helped catapult them into a sales leadership role. So now they're both a leader and a technical expert. So in fairness, the deck is stacked against them from a listening perspective anyway. They get in their own way. Sometimes I think they're listening, sometimes they're not. Sometimes I don't think they need to listen to. We could go any number of ways. But when it comes to getting sales leaders specifically to truly listen to what their team is telling them, separate the excuses from the reasons, the valid from the invalid, all the above, to be the catalyst that you're talking about. How do you work with sales leaders to get admittedly and reasonably, like I'm not casting blame, like quite like they should be in a position where it's harder for them to listen. That's not an insult. Their success is what makes it harder for them to listen. How do you work with this specific group that can be more challenged to listen than many others to help them be more effective listening to their team?
I love this question. So there's a lot of energy and pressure on individuals that you just described. Those sales leaders who are operating under immense pressure. And I think, and I'll just speak from personal experience, as I moved up, so when you're a mid-level manager, you're more open. And because you feel like you're more connected to probably a smaller subgroup of people. As you get elevated into the organizations, SVP, VP of sales, whatever the title might be, but you have a broader scope of responsibility. You're viewed differently and you start to act differently. Not intentionally, it's very much unintentionally. But then your sphere of influence gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And I think when your sphere of influence gets tighter, oftentimes we close ourselves off to feedback and input. We're not at the field level traveling with our reps anymore. We're relying on others, information for others. And oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes the people you've surrounded yourself are really, really loyal to you. And so I think the first step I would encourage people is to step outside of your comfort zone, literally and physically. The people who are accustomed to telling you what you want to hear, and find the people that will give you the truth. I mean, it's that simple. You have to look for the feedback so that at least you have a balanced point of view on what's really happening. And you're right. The further up in the organization, you probably lose a level of patience around that type of feedback. And for whatever reason, we don't want to hear it. And I would throw myself in that category. There were many times where I would say, yeah, but we do surveys, we get engagement scores, we do all this work that we want to hear from the organization. And then we somehow try to justify away the feedback we're receiving. And it goes back to the idea of tension, because we don't want to have to face the tension. It's hard work to shift strategy, for example, or focus, or make changes in the organization that you need to make, whatever it is. Like, that's hard work. And we don't want to address that tension. And again, time and time again, if I think about my first panic attack I had when I was 19, living with anxiety for most of my adult life, the point where I became free, physically and emotionally free, was when I started to turn toward the tension that I didn't want to address. And that's the reality of what happens. We get, I'm not suggesting that you still don't have to be discreet. You do. Withholding information is also an ability, and you can't have the open communication and dialogue as the more senior you get that you once did, because you have to be really, really careful and thoughtful about who you speak to, what you say, because it could get misinterpreted. But if you're really, really clear about what the vision looks like, and you're really important, and more importantly, you're willing to turn towards that tension that exists in the organization and not rely on just a small little group of people around you that want to tell you what you want to hear, I think that's the secret. And it's really quite simple.
It's a huge secret, and so many thoughts there. If hopefully we all have people in our lives that will tell us the truth. Certainly my wife will, my brother will, several good friends of mine will. I had the opportunity to co-facilitate a program with a friend who I occasionally get to work with a few weeks ago in Arizona. And we sat down together after at the bar, and it was like, only tell me the things you think I need to do better. Don't tell me anything else. And we were able to have that conversation, but we're able to have that conversation because we've built trust over time. And so I think what you're talking about now ties so well into what we were talking about 5 or 10 minutes ago, that if we're communicating with people in a way where the message is clear, we're consistent in our communication, both in messaging and in frequency, all too often, because we get busy, we don't communicate with people consistently. It's easy to excuse that or to justify that. And the greater the gaps in communication, the harder it is for people to trust us or believe what we're saying. They tend to question our motives and intentions more. So to create that consistency, to be more transparent when we can, to your point, but all of that over time allows us to expand what we can talk to people about, because they won't be judging our intentions. They won't be questioning where we come from. They won't be necessarily waiting for the shoe to drop. Trust in many ways is based on evidence. So how consistently am I giving people evidence that what I'm saying is true, consistent, well-intentioned, team-oriented, outcome-focused, based on objective formulas or objective, what's the word that I'm looking for now? Everybody can giggle at me, but we're evaluating it not just on how I feel or what I want. Like there's objective points of measurement. That's the word that starts with M that I've been looking for the last 30 seconds. Measurement. Objective points of measurement that we can look at throughout. So all of those things are extremely important. As we can be judicious about what we say, but we can open it up more.
Yeah. I love evidence, and the evidence of consistency. One of the things that I took great pride in as a leader is and it definitely comes from my Midwest, my small town Indiana upbringing. It 100% does. I used to say all the time, "There's nothing up my sleeve. What you see is what you get." I wanted people to view me and understand who I was as a person authentically, and I think a lot of leaders are unwilling to do that too.
Yeah,
and so. And through demonstrating vulnerability, every time I communicated to any team, any organization, whether main stage, big event, I would always share a personal story. But why did I do that? Because I wanted people to know what was in my heart. What were my core values? And by the way, my core values are decency, trust, performance, team first, image of leadership. 5 core values. I created them years and years ago because that was my North Star. That was my compass. And I wanted people to feel that when they were with me. Now, did I have to make really difficult decisions time and time again? Absolutely. Did it hurt to make some of these decisions? Absolutely. I remember closing an office at one point in my career. It was the most horrific experience of my life because it was impacting a lot of people. But at least I wanted them to know when I was there that my heart and emotion was pure, that I realized it was impacting them in a less than optimal way, and that at the end of the day, difficult decisions have to be made by executive leaders. That's what we're paid to do. But I can do it with a heart, and I can do it with compassion. And that was always my goal. No matter if I was making a difficult decision or not, I wanted people to understand who I was at my core, to show, to your point, Michael, to have, so they had evidence like, hey, this guy's a good guy. And sometimes, whether they could see it or not, sometimes he's just got to make some difficult decisions.
Great point. And to use your point about telling a personal story, for me, I found as long as it is truthful, that it's a great way to get other people to open up. And it could be something as simple as I'm trying to teach somebody to do a new process. And so I could tell them how to do it and ask them if they have any questions, to which they're going to say no and go screw it up, which is going to frustrate me and embarrass them, and the downward spiral starts. Or I could tell a true story about the first time I learned that process or a similar process and how I thought I had it under control, but I made these mistakes that I wouldn't have made if I asked these questions. So keeping that in mind, how many questions have I created so far before we get started?
I love that.
It's infinitely easier for somebody to open up and ask a question. To your point earlier, and I know this is how you illustrated it. If I'm going to ask somebody to tell me their story, here's my story. Now that I've shared my story, I'm going to ask you to share yours. Yeah. So it's reciprocity and scarcity really working together, because almost nobody communicates that way.
No.
So now go ahead.
No, please. I love that. I love that. And here's why what you do works, and why what I did worked, is that when we tell a story that demonstrates a level of vulnerability in ourselves, we release oxytocin. But the beautiful part about that, so does the person receiving the story. So in that environment, you're showing somebody how to do a new process, as an example. Probably nervous, probably concerned, probably has a little cortisol and energy about the potential negative impact. Michael's showing me, feels a bit overwhelmed, maybe feels under pressure. But when you told that story about your experience and you demonstrated vulnerability, you're releasing oxytocin, and so is that person. And so you're freeing them up unintentionally in a very beautiful way. You're freeing them up just to be present and exist, to get them more to a creative space where they're more apt to learn. That's the power of vulnerability. And this is data-driven, evidence-driven. This is Dr. Sue Carter, Indiana University. I reached out to her as I was developing some concepts around vulnerability, she's an expert on oxytocin. She's been studying it for years. And I said, "Hey, Dr. Sue, here's my theory. If I'm in a room with a bunch of complete strangers and I'm telling a story and I demonstrate a level of vulnerability, do I release oxytocin?" Well, absolutely. Does the audience of unknown people, they don't know me, I don't know them? Her answer was, yes, they do. Like, so that's the cheat code to human connection. At the end of the day, this is a life about human connection. We started about the law of vibration, that energy we emote. If we're sharing a story, sharing our vulnerabilities, our challenges, where we fell and tripped and or where we made a mess, or where we you're allowing people to exist in a whole different light. And I think that's the challenge, man. If there's one thing that, like, if I view the work that I'm doing, that's the challenge. Unmask yourself and you'll unmask others. And then all of a sudden, everybody rises. And a rising tide does raise all boats, especially in an environment that requires it.
Unmask yourself to unmask others. The hit machine continues. I feel like we could do it. Remember back in the day when we used to get CDs, or even before that?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The records. Yeah. I feel like if I had the creative ability, I could create like the back channel of a CD with your best quotes as like a track list for you. I don't have the ability to do that.
I don't either.
But what we're talking about is it's a core component of how I talk to people in order to get them to connect, to listen, and to execute. It's true in leadership conversations. It's true in business communications. It's true with my son. Yep. I've had the opportunity, thankfully, to in some way, shape, or form, coach my son with a lot of sports that he's played. When my son goes up to bat in baseball, he's in elementary school. The last thing he's going to hear me say as he comes out of the dugout is, "I love you." When he did his first jiu-jitsu competition, before he went on the mat, every single time, he had 6 matches that day. Before he went out, every single time, the last thing he heard me say was, "I love you." Because, yeah, there were instructions and remember this and do that. But I don't want him walking up feeling tense. I got to remember to do this. I want him going out, remember that above all else, his dad loves him. Nothing else matters. So to connect with people, now maybe we don't want to say "I love you" to every single person we talk to, ending the conversation. Yeah. But if we can connect with them in a way that helps them relax and creates that we shared that vulnerability, it's okay for you to be vulnerable. Now it's okay for you to accept risk and legitimately go out and try to do your best.
Well, I love that, and Michelle and I raised two Division I athletes. Same thing. Like, you don't want to put undue pressure on anyone. So I love that you do that for your son, because you want him to be free. You want him to be free to perform. And there's no difference in corporate America. Love is not I used to say this all the time when I was in corporate. Love isn't a word that people want to use there. All right, use agape. Or I see you, I understand you, I appreciate you. I mean, you know how far that goes with people? And it is 100% about emotional energy and tone. And so the way I always viewed it, and still to this day, when I'm interacting with somebody, if somebody gets on and does a discovery call or a clarity call with me, I am being completely open to them. And what I'm thinking the entire time I'm with them, because I know energy emotes, the thing I'm thinking is like, I really appreciate you. I care for you. Even if I don't know them, Michael, because it's going to translate. They're going to feel that from me. And at the end of the day, I'm on this journey that I'm on now to help leaders and salespeople. It's that simple. And there's so many of us just feel so much pressure to perform that we can't perform. And we're like, why aren't we performing? It's because you haven't turned toward the tension. And that starts with self-evaluation, and then we go through the process that we talked about today.
With the few minutes that we have left, and I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but you probably have other things planned.
Likewise. No.
With the few minutes that we've got left, if I can ask, you talked a little bit about earlier, you mentioned your own journey from panic attacks and anxiety and then turning towards the tension, which you just mentioned. I'm sure that I shouldn't say I'm sure. Just by hearing what you said, it sounds like learning to turn towards the tension is what kicked you free of a lot of what might have been, maybe this is the wrong word, correctly, paralyzed you or created some of the issues for you in that. What are some of the other lessons, if you're comfortable sharing, and if you're not, tell me, that you're comfortable sharing from your personal journey, overcoming panic attacks and anxiety that we can all learn from and hopefully apply in our own way?
Oh, man, I'm glad you asked. So I referenced earlier, I had my first panic attack when I was a junior in college, and it was triggered. It's not the cause, I know that now, but it was triggered by, I was a Division I basketball player at Niagara University, And I went to go tell the trainer and the coaching staff that I was going to transfer. And back then there was no portal. So you actually had to be compliance signature and the coaches had to release you. And as I was telling Ray Kist, who was our athletic trainer at the time, and Ray, just to paint the picture of Ray was a combination of Tony Soprano and Pat Riley. But
there's a mental picture.
Yes, but he was 5'7", maybe 5'6", and his favorite word started with an F. And Ray, that's right. Ray and I spent a lot of time together because I was on crutches for 18 to 24 months before I decided I just couldn't play anymore. I mean, but at that moment when I was sharing with Ray that I was going to leave, I just started sweating uncontrollably. My heart rate just went pounding through my chest. I was blurred vision. I felt like a tunnel. Don't remember anything I said, but I just remember how I felt. And so that was the beginning of living with anxiety and panic. And so the panic, think good, and those in the audience who've ever had a panic attack, it's really quite uncomfortable. And it's always the anticipation of the next panic attack that makes it worse. And it's getting out of that cycle, break that cycle. So the panic attacks continued for probably 5 to 10 years as I launched into my corporate career in sales, et cetera. But it wasn't until 2 years ago that everything finally came into a kind of a more balanced existence for me. And it was our oldest daughter, Aubrey, and she's comfortable with me telling this story. But she was having a real difficult time. She was a Division I soccer player, and she'd been benched, and she had flunked a speech class, ironically. And she had left a sports psychologist, and she just felt overwhelmed. And Michelle came up the stairs here in my office. It's like, you need to call Aub. And so before I called her, the thing I thought about was like, okay, she's having similar challenges to what I did. And my identity was basketball, small town Indiana kid, like it's a rite of passage.
Larry Bird.
Larry Bird. It was a beautiful place to grow up. But what I now have realized is that I was carrying all of this pressure to perform with me. And my identity was basketball, not who I am today. And so effectively I caved myself in. And so before I called Aubrey, I'm like, what would I wanted to hear? First thing I would want to hear was like, I'm not broken. Like that was one thing. And I would also wanted to hear everything is going to be okay. It's going to work out just fine, which it has for me. Like again, no victim here at all. Life has been very, very good to me. So I called her and we just had an unbelievable conversation. But one of the things I did in that conversation was I told her that her dad had been living with anxiety his entire life. And she was blown away. And oh, by the way, very similar to people who hear my story that have known me for years, I never told anybody outside of my wife that I was living with anxiety. And it was that moment that I felt as if 20 pianos had been lifted off my back because I had finally unmasked what I had been kind of hiding deeply for years. And I became truly myself in that moment, in a very vulnerable moment, and more importantly, I helped my daughter realize that everything is going to be fine. And she entered the transfer portal herself. She transferred to Valparaiso University. She started every single game, barely came off the field. In fact, was so committed to her team. She played the last 2 months on a stress fracture in her shin. They won the Missouri Valley Conference tournament. She was all tournament team, and they played Notre Dame in the first round. And now she's gone on to start a really great career. But that moment defined me. And what I realized is that it was much better for us together to run toward the tension we were both feeling, and we could do it together, which we did. And my life changed and her life changed. And that's really the story of, and again, I'm still very much a work in progress. I'm not a finished product yet. But I realized now that there was I was harboring so much tension in my life that it was necessary for me really to lean into it. And what I realize now is what I was always concerned of being found out. Like this really successful executive leader is going to get found out. And I carry that with me every single day. And now that that's been released. And in that moment, not only did I feel like 20 pianos were lifted off my back, you could literally feel the energy leave my body.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm an open book.
And I can imagine you talked about the oxytocin transition before, having that conversation with your daughter. I'm sure that elevated that transition even higher, considering your relationship to begin with, which was probably even more impactful for you both as a result of that conversation.
100%. And this is why I am so encouraging of leaders and everyone for that matter to tell stories of vulnerability. When I'm giving keynotes, I flash up on the screen every single time. Vulnerability transforms strangers into allies and stories into shared experiences. And if we think about the kind of the triangle of trust, shared experiences, affinity, communication, the idea is for us to see ourselves in others. And if we can see ourselves in others, trust gets amplified. And if I have 10, 12, 13 people on my organization, my team, all living those principles that I see you, Michael, I believe in you, I understand who you are, you'll catch lightning in a bottle. You're not going to do it every time, but you'll catch lightning in a bottle. And it's happened a couple times in my career where you just saw your team absolutely take off. And it was just so fun and rewarding to see people that loved each other, dare I say, cared about each other, looked out for each other, and were 100% aligned on what we were trying to accomplish. It is 100% possible.
Fully agree. And I think that's a great way to wrap up before I just continue asking you questions and we drag this on for another hour. If you're up for it, I'd love to do this again sometime when we can light up our calendars. I feel like there's a whole lot more that we could talk about. I took 2 full pages of notes while you were talking. So hopefully everybody listening was taking notes. And this is likely one of those episodes you're going to have to rewind and be like, wait a minute, what did he say? What are those 4? What are those 3? There was so much packed in there. So for the people that enjoyed this conversation and want more from you, where do they need to go to connect with you?
So my website is the Scott Ramey, Ramey, Scott with 2 T's, thescottramey.com. And then I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I mean, that's kind of where I find my, ideal client customer profile, where my voice resonates the most. So LinkedIn, again, Scott Ramey on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And I'll make sure those links are absolutely in the show notes so people don't have to go hunt for them. Man, it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. Tremendous conversation. I really appreciate everything that you shared, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Michael, thank you. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Take care. We'll talk to you soon. Scott, thank you for an awesome conversation. I really appreciate all you shared, the depth that you went into, the personal examples, the business examples, all the great quotes, but even more importantly, all of the takeaways we have that we can apply to our conversations as sales leaders, but also as leaders of other teams as well, and even with our families. Thank you so much. Your idea that our teams are already whispering what we're afraid to talk about is a great point. Just surface the tension. The importance of surfacing the tension so we can work through it is of critical importance. Thank you. I also loved your idea that our influence, is often reflected by who repeats us. I thought that was a tremendous thought. And maybe, it's a debate, but maybe the thing that I like the most is your idea of be the cause, not the effect. I like that so much. Thank you for a great conversation, Scott. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who took the time to join us today. We appreciate you being back here week after week. Thank you so much. Hopefully you took more notes than I did in a great conversation. I couldn't keep up. And now you have a new approach for your team, your customers, your family, and beyond. While you're here, please take a quick second, like the show, share it, subscribe to it, give us your feedback. What would you like to hear more or less of? We'd love to hear from you. And of course, please check out our sponsors. Head over to humantel.com. That's where you can learn all you need to know to begin to identify what people are thinking or feeling at any moment in time by identifying shifts in their facial expressions and nonverbal communication. So over at humantel.com, enter the code Inquasive25 for 25% off their best-in-class training. For the professional interviewers who are interested in learning more about how you can contribute to the International Association of Interviewers, head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. You'll get all your questions answered, and while you're there, you can also learn all you need to know about the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation. Who qualifies? How do you earn the designation? What can it mean for your career? And while you're online, please head over to Inquasive.com. That's where you can learn more about the programs our clients ask us to customize for their senior leaders, sales teams, HR teams, and beyond to teach them how to connect with people in a way that encourages them to share sensitive information under vulnerable circumstances in the face of consequences. We really appreciate y'all being here week after week. Thank you so very much. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.